in the quiet corners of the world, where the frost never quite melts and the trees have stood in silence for centuries. There are stories so old and so fragile that they have begun to fade into the snow itself. They are not found in textbooks, nor often recited in great halls. They do not begin with kings or kingdoms, or with banners raised high in the sun. Instead, they begin in a hush, in the long silence between winds. In the flicker of a hearth when the flames begin to settle, in the slow rhythm of snowfall on rooftops already white. One such story lingers still, like a whisper held in the branches of a winter forest. It is a tale not of conquest, but of resistance. Not of loud declarations, but of quiet boundaries no one dared to cross. It is the story of a people who frightened the very warriors the world once feared most. Long ago, in the centuries we now call medieval, though they would not have known the word, there rose a people of immense reputation, the Norsemen, the Vikings, known to many, remembered by most. Their sails were stretched like wings across the grey Atlantic. Their ships creaked with the weight of timber, warriors, and intent. Their stories spilled from the fjords of Norway, across the isles of Britain, and into the rivers of distant lands whose names we still struggle to pronounce. They were raiders, yes, but also farmers, poets, and seekers. They were fathers and sons, blacksmiths and dreamers. They held fast to old gods, to Odin and Thor, to Loki's mischief and Freya's grace. And with every voyage they took, with every shoreline they reached, they brought with them both the fear of the unknown and the hope of something more. The Vikings sailed to the east, to lands now known as Russia and Ukraine. They built towns and kingdoms, traded with empires, and returned with coins and silks, spices and stories. They went west, too, crossing wide oceans to reach distant shores, even touching the edges of what we now call North America, long before any others dared. They went south, to Byzantium, where gold gleamed and strange languages sang through bustling markets. They were, in many ways, unstoppable, but not entirely. There were places untouched, places that did not bow, did not trade, did not burn beneath the Viking torch. And as night fell around fires in the far reaches of Viking territory, stories were sometimes told in quiet tones, barely above the crackle of wood. Stories of a cold land to the north, a land deeper than maps and darker than thought, where the snow never fully melted and where eyes watched from trees that had no leaves. Stories of the watchers in the white forest. These tales were not told. Often, and when they were shared with a mix of awe and unease. For even the boldest warrior, after enough ale and silence, might admit there were some places best left untravelled. And at the heart of these tales stood the Biamians, people not written of often, not drawn in detail, not marked by stone or scripture, but remembered faintly, reverently, fearfully. The Biamians did not build cities, or sail ships, or shout into battle. They moved like mist. They knew the forests and the snow in ways no outsider could, and for reasons not fully understood, their name alone, when whispered in Viking camps, was enough to still the conversation and tighten the breath. This is their story, or at least the shape of their story. For so much has been lost, as stories tend to be when left in the hands of snow and time. But perhaps it is not the shape of the tale that matters most. Perhaps it is the feeling it leaves behind, like a distant wind brushing your cheek in the middle of the night. So let us begin not with thunder, but with hush. Let us walk slowly into this story, step by step, footfall by footfall. letting each detail settle around us like the soft drift of snowflakes. The Norse, those famed seafarers of old, believed the world was filled with spirits, not just gods in the sky, but things in the wood, in the water, in the wind. And though they painted themselves as brave, men who laughed at death and met it sword in hand, there were moments, rare but real, when fear took hold, not fear of men, but of the unseen, of the unknown, of those who moved without sound and struck without warning. Far to the north, past the great fjords, beyond the reach of even the boldest skald's song, stretched a world of thick forest, frozen lakes, and silence that seemed to breathe. The Vikings called it Biamians, and they rarely went there. It was not that they could not. The Norse had the ships, they had the maps, they had the strength. But strength is not always the answer. Sometimes it is silence that wins. The Biamians, as we have come to call them, did not seek battle. They did not storm the southern coasts or demand tribute from towns. They lived where the cold was constant, where the sky was pale and the trees grew thin but tall. They knew the paths the animals took, the safe ways across frozen rivers, the places where snow held secrets. To the Norse, they were ghosts. To themselves, they were simply home. Archaeologists, centuries later, would piece together fragments of bone, of tools, of garments and graves, and slowly begin to see the outline of a people who had learned to live, not by changing the land, but by becoming part of it. They wore clothes made not just to protect, but to blend. They traveled not by foot alone, but by ski, by sled, by clever devices shaped through generations of need and knowing. They knew how to vanish, how to listen, and when needed, how to defend without ever being seen. Tonight, as your eyes begin to grow heavier and your breath softens into rhythm, we will not raise weapons or chase shadows. We will not cheer great victories or mourn fallen empires. We will simply follow the snow, follow the soft prints that disappear behind each drift, follow the cold wind that knows more than it tells, and follow the quiet story of the Biamians, a people who may be gone from the world, but not yet from the whisper of its trees. As you drift deeper into this northern tale, know that this is not a story of conquest. Not really. It is, instead, a reminder that some powers are loud, but others are quiet, and sometimes it is the quiet ones who last the longest. Now, let us gently turn to the time before their paths crossed, to the world of the Norse, when the forests were still unknown, and the dread had yet to come. Let us now drift softly into the world the Norse knew, before they had ever heard the name Biamond, before their longships brushed the edges of frozen forests, before their bravest warriors whispered of unseen eyes watching from white branches. The Vikings lived in a world of their own, a world shaped by sea, by storm, by tradition, and by ambition. To understand why the story of the Biamians matters, we must first understand the reach of those who came to fear them. Let us turn our thoughts now to the time when Nor's ambition stretched its limbs across the known world. A time of sails and stone hearths, of smoky halls echoing with songs, of gods with one eye and hammers that shook the sky. This was the world of the Vikings. And in this world, the North still held mysteries they had yet to face. It is often said that the Viking Age began with a raid. The year was 793. The place, Lindisfarne, an island monastery off the northeast coast of what is now England. Peaceful. Monks lived there, surrounded by sea and prayer, until one morning, when longships cut through the mist and men with axes stepped silently onto the sand. The raid was swift and brutal. But more than that, it was the start of something much larger. From that moment forward, the Vikings would not be remembered only in their own villages and valleys. They would be remembered across all of Europe and far beyond. Their world, once bounded by mountains and cold sea, began to open. And they did not hesitate to step into it. They were not yet called Vikings, not in the way we now use the word. They were Norse, people of the north. They came from the lands we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Each group with its own dialect, its own loyalties, its own dreams. But they shared certain ways of life. They lived close to the earth, close to the sea, and closer still to the rhythms of nature. Winter shaped them, hunger shaped them, and so did the long darkness that stretched over their homes for half the year. In the face of this, they built lives of deep resilience. They carved wooden halls to keep the cold at bay. They farmed where soil allowed. They fished where waters fed them. And when the land gave too little, they took to the sea, not as aimless wanderers, but as precise navigators. Skilled craftsmen built sleek, strong vessels from oak and pine. Longships, they were called, not for their shape alone, but for the journeys they would take. These ships could travel across oceans and slip into shallow rivers. They were swift and silent, with shallow drafts and single sails. Their construction was so precise that they bent with the waves instead of breaking against them. In these ships, the Norsemen found the freedom that the mountains denied them, and so they spread. From the quiet villages of Scandinavia, they spread westward to the coasts of Ireland, Scotland, and England. They raided towns, but they also stayed. They settled. They built new lives in new lands. In Dublin, they created a thriving port. In York, they made a city. In Iceland, they found a place of refuge and beauty. In Greenland, they pushed the limits of the habitable world. And in Vinland, what we now call North America, they left faint but real traces. To the east, they sailed through the great rivers of Russia, the Volkhov, the Dnieper, the Don. They traded with Slavs, fought with Khazars, and eventually founded what would become the state of Kievan Rus. The city of Novgorod carries echoes of Norse footsteps still. Farther still, they reached Constantinople, that glittering heart of the Byzantine world. There, Norse warriors became elite bodyguard, Shivarangian guard, to the emperor himself. In that city of domes and icons, Norsemen stood watch beside marble and gold. They sailed also to the south, through narrow straits, around stormy capes. They reached the shores of the Islamic world, trading in Baghdad and the ports of the Caspian. Silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate have been found buried deep in the soil of Sweden. Wherever there was opportunity, they went. And wherever they went, they left both fear and memory. But they were not only raiders. They were also traders, settlers, farmers, craftsmen, and poets. The image of the horn-helmeted berserker is but a shadow of a much broader truth. They brought goods, amber, walrus, ivory, furs, soapstone, iron. They brought stories, sagas carved in wood, told aloud beside fires. And they brought beliefs of gods who walked among men, of fate woven by unseen hands, of honor that could outlive the body. They brought death, but they also brought life. The Norse world prized courage to face death with song, to greet suffering with a kind of grim joy, to speak truth even if it cut. These were not mere values. They were expectations. Honor mattered more than gold. A man's word was his reputation. and reputation was everything. An insult left unavenged could tarnish a family's name for generations. In this world, strength was not only physical, it was spiritual, mental, and communal. A man's strength was judged by how he faced hardship, and the Norse faced much of it. Long winters, lean harvests, rough seas, and always the knowledge that the gods watched, even when men failed. They worshipped the old gods. Odin, the All-Father, who traded an eye for wisdom. Thor, the Thunderer, who protected mankind with his hammer. Freya, goddess of beauty and war. Loki, the trickster. Balder, the beloved. They believed in Valhalla, a hall for the honored dead. In Helheim, the cold realm of the forgotten. In Niflheim, where ice never thaws. In the great tree Yggdrasil, whose roots and branches held the 9 realms. Their world was enchanted. It was not merely physical. It was layered with spirits in the forests, trolls in the mountains, elves in the meadows, and shadows beneath the waves. To the Norse, the world was alive in ways that cannot be measured. And in that living world, they saw themselves as warriors in the great dance of fate. Yet even as they stretched across lands and seas, there remained places they dared not go, not for lack of ships or strength, but because of something more elusive, something they could not explain or overcome. The far north, beyond the northern fjords of Norway, beyond the reindeer lands and the snow-blanketed hills, lay forests that were too thick, too silent, too still. This was not the silence of peace, but the silence of watching, a silence that pressed against the skin, a silence that made warriors lower their voices and priests reach for charms. There were rumors, of course. There always are. Whispers of spirits, of lights in the sky that moved without sound, of men who did not leave footprints, of watchers in the woods whose eyes glowed when the moon was hidden. The Norse called that northern land Biamians. Some said it meant Edgeland. Others called it the land of mist. No one agreed. Few ever went, and fewer still returned. The sagas make passing mention of it, a vague warning here, a lost expedition there, a fragment of runes scratched onto stone near Trondheim reads, "They see without being seen. They kill without sound. They are not men, as we know men. These were not lands to be taken lightly. They were not lands to be taken at all. For all their strength, the Norse were still men. And every culture, no matter how bold, has its shadow. The Biamians would become that shadow for the Vikings. Not an empire, not a kingdom, but a people who knew their land better than any outsider could, who did not meet sword with sword, but with silence, who left no trail, but made their presence known through fear. The Norse, who had faced down kings and warlords, would find themselves unsettled by men and women who made no claims, flew no banners, and left no graves. And that was the beginning of something the Vikings did not expect, a boundary they could not cross, a silence they could not break, a fear they could not explain. As we leave this chapter of Viking expansion, we do not leave behind their courage or their accomplishments, but we begin to see their limits. Even the strongest can be humbled by the unknown, and in the coldest corners of their world, the Norse found a people who reminded them of that truth. Let us now gently turn our gaze northward, to the snowy forests, where these silent people lived. Let us walk quietly into the world of the Biamians. As we step softly into the northern forests, beyond the reach of Viking settlements and far past the familiar fjords and rivers, we begin to sense a different kind of world. This was not the world of kings and battles, of stone churches or golden chalices. It was older in a quieter way, shaped not by conquest, but by endurance. Here lived the Biamians, people not widely chronicled in sagas or carved into stones, yet remembered in silence, in warnings, in the shifting eyes of those who had heard of them. They did not raise great halls or build fortified towns. Instead, they wove their lives into the very fabric of the land they knew better than any map could suggest. Their homes stretched across what we now know as northern Finland, the Kola Peninsula, and parts of northwestern Russia, a landscape of dense forest, frozen lakes, shifting tundra, and winter skies that pressed low over the trees. In this vast and unyielding environment, they thrived. To outsiders, this land seemed unwelcoming, a place of hunger and hardship, of bitter winds and dark silence. But to the Biamians, it was a place of memory, of movement, and of meaning. They had no need to tame the forest because they were part of it. They followed the rhythms of snow and thaw, of migrations and solstice. Their settlements were rarely permanent. They moved with the seasons, living lightly, but not loosely, always with knowledge passed down in word, in gesture, in patient observation of the land itself. They were likely related in ancestry or cultural lineage to the Sami or other Finno-Ugric peoples. These groups, spread across the subarctic north, shared many traits: a respect for animals and spirits, an economy based on reindeer herding, hunting, and fishing, and a tendency toward egalitarian social structures. But the Biamians, while perhaps of similar root, were distinct. They left behind clues that suggest a culture carefully shaped by its particular geography. Their lives were quiet, but not simple. They built their dwellings low and strong, often half sunk into the earth for warmth. These homes were layered with sod and birch bark, with central fire pits that gave off little smoke, vented carefully, so as not to betray their location. Within these shelters, families lived closely together, surrounded by furs, tools, dried foods, and ancestral objects. Time was marked by light and temperature, not by clocks or church bells. In the long dark months of winter, they told stories, sang softly, repaired clothing and sleds, and prepared offerings for the spirits that moved, as they believed. Just beyond the veil of what could be seen, their clothing was born of necessity, and refined through generations of cold. It was not only warm, but precise. They used furs of animals selected for specific conditions: reindeer hide for insulating the body, fox for lightweight warmth, seal for waterproof layers, and birds for feather-lined boots. Plant fibers, like nettle or inner birch bark, were used in weaving and padding. Leather was carefully tanned using smoke, fat, and thyme. Nothing was wasted. Every item was a response to the environment. From the wide snowshoes they wore to cross soft drifts, to the hand-sewn mittens lined with hair fur and stitched with bone needles. To move across the land, they built sleds and skis. Their skis were curved at the tips, sometimes covered in animal hide to grip the snow when climbing. Poles carved from light pine or spruce helped maintain balance. These technologies, while simple in appearance, were the product of deep environmental understanding. They allowed the Biamians to travel efficiently through snow that would trap horses and confuse Norse scouts. They glided silently through white woods, their breath muffled by fur, their presence barely more than a ripple in the frost. Their tools and weapons were equally well suited to their needs. They did not craft heavy swords or battle axes. They preferred lighter, more agile equipment, bows with flat limbs, ideal for tight forest spaces, slender spears balanced for throwing, curved knives perfect for both skinning animals and defending silently. These weapons were not ceremonial. They were practical, efficient, and used only when needed. Their bows, often backed with sinew and horn, were decorated subtly, with etched lines or symbols meant more for spiritual connection than vanity. In terms of food, they relied heavily on what the land provided. They followed reindeer herds, fished under the ice, gathered berries and roots in the brief summers, and trapped birds and small mammals using ingenious techniques. They preserved meat through drying, smoking, and fermenting. Fish were buried in cold pits lined with moss and stone. Berries were mixed with fat and marrow to make concentrated energy foods for the winter. Their diet was high in protein and fat, designed to fuel the body in sub-zero temperatures. They drank infusions of bark, herbs, and mushrooms for warmth and healing. One particularly prized fungus, now known as chaga, was harvested from birch trees and brewed into a dark, earthy tea, believed to strengthen the spirit and ward off illness. The Biamians lived not in isolated family units, but in loose networks of kinship. Tribes or clans moved together across shared territories. Decision-making was often communal, based on wisdom and consensus rather than rank or inheritance. The elders were respected not for their dominance, but for their memory and insight. Among them, shamans held special roles. These were men and women, often chosen in childhood, who trained in spiritual practice, medicine, and the hidden ways of the land. They were guides, healers, dreamers, and sometimes warriors. Their faces were often painted with ash or ochre. Their clothing carried bells or bones. They could be heard singing to the trees at twilight, or seen dancing beside a fire, communicating with what others could not see. Spiritual life was deeply interwoven with every action. The Biamians believed that all things, stone, tree, water, wind, possessed a spirit. These spirits were not distant deities to be petitioned, but neighbors to be respected. Each hunt required ritual. Each journey was marked by offering. Birth and death were transitions, not endings. The dead were not buried far from the living, but kept near in special shelters. Their bodies were dried by fire and cold, then wrapped in birch bark and placed in high places, cliffs, watch houses where they could look over the land and protect it. These ancestors were spoken to, consulted, and occasionally visited in dreams. The Biamians had no written language, as far as we know, but their memory was long. Knowledge passed from mouth to ear, from gesture to imitation. Children learned by doing, by watching, by being folded into the daily rhythm of survival. By the age of 10, a child might know how to track an elk, read the wind, recognize the difference between safe and deadly mushrooms, and interpret the calls of birds overhead. By 20, they could move through the forest without sound, knowing where to step, when to pause, how to breathe without steam rising from the lips. They were not trained in the way a Viking boy might train for battle, with shield and spear, but their training was no less rigorous. It was simply focused on different kinds of knowledge, the kind that could not be easily measured, but was essential to survival. Because of this way of life, the Biamians left behind very little in the way of ruins. No great stone temples, no written chronicles. What we know of them comes from fragment stools, bones, bits of clothing preserved in ice, the occasional structure sunk into the peat and uncovered by accident centuries later, and of course, from the stories told by outsiders. Norse sagas speak of them with a mixture of fascination and dread. They are rarely named directly, often referred to in riddles or metaphors. A few inscriptions hint at encounters, often marked by loss or confusion. One account mentions a group of traders who disappeared beyond the pines. Their camp later found empty, but 4 strange footprints and symbols carved into the bark of trees. These fragments, while sparse, suggest a people who were aware of the world beyond their forest, but chose not to engage with it in ways others might expect. They did not seek alliance or war. They did not ask to be left alone, but made it clear that they would not be disturbed. And when they were, they responded not with declarations, but with disappearance, with precision, with knowledge of the land that turned every tree into shelter, every snowbank into shield. To the Vikings, who were used to measuring strength in noise and numbers, this was profoundly unsettling. The Biamians could not be predicted. They did not fight in the open. They did not shout their names or claim glory. Yet they seemed to know where Norsemen camped, how many there were, where they would go next. They appeared and vanished without warning. And when they struck, it was often at night, with no sound but the soft thump of snow. This way of moving, this refusal to meet force with force, created an image of supernatural power. It is no surprise that some Norse believed the Biamians could turn into animals or walk through trees. But there was no magic, only mastery. Mastery of place, of pattern, of patience. Their strength lay not in domination, but in adaptation, in the ability to survive in a world that few outsiders could even endure. Their homeland, so quiet and harsh, was not a prison or exile. It was sanctuary. It gave them everything they needed and asked in return only care and attentiveness. And, in that contract with nature, the Biamians flourished. To understand how the Biamians resisted the Vikings, we must first understand the land they called home. Their greatest weapon was not forged from metal, but from deep familiarity with the unforgiving northern wilderness. In these remote forests, snow-covered plains, and ice-bound rivers, the Biamians did not merely survive, they thrived. Their world was one of long winters and short, bright summers, of silence broken only by wind and the distant call of birds. Where others saw hardship, the Biamians saw opportunity. They learned to move with the snow, not against it. Snowshoes kept them afloat on deep drifts. Skis carved from pine carried them swiftly across frozen fields, and lightweight sleds hauled supplies without effort. They dressed in layers of fur and bark fiber, each piece handcrafted for warmth and silence. Their shelters blended into the land, half buried, smoke-free, nearly invisible beneath a canopy of trees. Fires were kept low, their smoke diffused to avoid detection. Every movement, every choice, was shaped by the demands of the cold, where a Viking warband might trudge noisily through the forest in chainmail and leather. Leaving footprints deep in the snow, the Biamians slipped silently between the trees. They left no trail. They knew when snow would fall and where the wind would carry sound. They used natural cues, a bent branch, a flicker in the snow, to track or avoid others. They mapped the land in memory, not on parchment. When Norsemen entered Biamian territory, they were met not with warriors, but with confusion. Scouts vanished, camps were watched. Fires burned under a quiet sky, but the sense of being followed lingered. Sometimes a symbol would appear carved into bark or a footprint where no one had passed. At other times, a body was found, not brutally butchered, but laid deliberately, with eyes closed and hands crossed, as if sent back with a message. The Biamians didn't fight open battles. They manipulated terrain instead. They dug traps hidden beneath snow. They guided intruders into bogs or across cracking ice. They struck only when it counted, quick, targeted, pre-seasoned, disappeared before retaliation. These tactics weren't born from cowardice, but from intelligence. Their aim was not conquest, but defense. Their victories lay in the invader's fear, not their own glory. Even their stillness was a strategy. Camouflaged in ash and fur, some could wait motionless for hours, blending into tree trunks or crouching beneath pine branches. Their arrows flew from unseen hands. Their presence was felt more than seen. And this unease, this quiet threat, was often more powerful than any sword. They listened to nature and made it an ally. The birds warned them, the snow spoke, the cold protected them. Everything was used. Every shadow, every silence, every snowflake falling from a branch held meaning. They knew when a stream froze deep or shallow, when wolves had passed, when the reindeer would move. Their rhythm matched the forest. An Arab traveler once wrote of them moving like ghosts across the snow. To him, they seemed to vanish at will, to glide through the landscape without touching it. And perhaps, to outsiders, that's how it felt. But it wasn't magic. It was knowledge, practiced over generations. The Biamians didn't dominate their land, they partnered with it. And in doing so, they became invisible, untraceable, invincible in their own way. The Vikings, used to open-field battles and proud declarations, were disoriented. Their tactics failed. Their armor weighed them down. Their voices echoed into empty trees. And the longer they stayed, the more they realized they weren't hunting. They were being watched. This is the kind of power that cannot be measured in numbers or noise. It is the quiet strength of those who know every whisper of the wind, every creak of the frost, every footstep in the snow. The Biamians turned their environment into a shield and a blade. In their silence, they sent a message: this forest belongs to those who listen. And in that silence, the Vikings began to retreat. The Vikings, for all their strength and courage, came from a world where war was loud and seen, where honor was found in standing face to face, blade to blade, shield to shield. They carved their legacy through ships that cut through waves and axes that split stone and skull alike. They conquered monasteries, claimed coastlines, and made empires tremble. But in the far white north, all that pride met something it could not match, something quiet, careful, and cold. The Biamians did not fight like the Vikings. In truth, they avoided what the Vikings would even call a battle. To the Biamians, war was not an event. It was a pattern. It was something drawn out over days, perhaps weeks. A slow unraveling of the enemy's senses, stability, and security. Their tactics were not based on force, but on understanding of both the land and the mind. They had 5 core tactics, each used with patience and precision. The first was simple: avoid open battle. Never engage where the enemy is prepared. Let them look, let them wait, let them waste time and strength staring into trees that will never move. If you are never seen, you can never be struck. The second was manipulation of the environment. The Biamians left false trails through deep snow, leading Viking scouts into frozen ravines or bogs hidden under thin crusts of ice. They set traps beneath the snow, pits lined with sharpened branches, branches tied to fall under weight, ice layers just thin enough to betray a step. In the dark woods, they created mirrored routes, confusing paths that led nowhere. A Viking group could walk for hours in a circle without knowing it. Exhausted and confused, their confidence slowly melting like frost in morning sun. The third tactic was psychological. Where Vikings bellowed war cries and stormed gates, the Biamians whispered through symbols. They left runes or markings carved into trees, not in Norse script, but in their own ancient signs, meant to confuse and unnerve. Sometimes these were simple shapes. Other times they were figures drawn in charcoal or blood, staring back from bark in the pale morning light. They left animal bones arranged in strange spirals, dolls made of twigs, eyes painted with ash, set upon rocks or hanging from branches, messages clear in their meaning. You are not welcome. They also used silence as a weapon. A Viking camp at night might begin to feel surrounded without a sound. Shadows between trees did not move, but still shifted somehow. Fires flickered without wind. Then a branch cracked in the distance. A raven called too late in the night. Nothing happened, and that was the point. The fear was planted. It would grow on its own. The fourth tactic was targeted elimination. If the Vikings had a leader, a chieftain, a captain, a man whose word held order, he would be the first to fall. Not in battle, but alone, apart from his men, during a brief walk or on guard. He would vanish, or he would be found the next morning, placed with care, his eyes closed, his throat opened, and a token left upon his chest, a feather, a stone, a symbol. There would be no trail, no sound, only questions. This shook Viking formations. Without leadership, without clear knowledge of who or what had struck, men hesitated. Morale dipped. And that was when the fifth tactic emerged. Coordinated withdrawal. The Biamians did not try to hold ground. They vanished after every action. Their goal was never territory, it was memory. The impression left behind became their true victory. When the Vikings finally turned back, they brought no treasure, no glory, only stories. These stories spread quickly, not as tales of war, but of something stranger. They spoke of people who moved without sound, who saw without being seen, of lights in the forest, of hunters who left no footprints, of forests that refused to be crossed. They called them the Watchers, the White Shadows, the Hidden Ones. Saga excerpts from later centuries speak in vague but fearful tones. One story tells of a band of Vikings who disappeared one by one while crossing a pine valley. Another tells of night terrors, of men waking in the night, unable to speak, only to find a single symbol drawn on their shield. One verse reads, "They came not by day, nor did they call by name. They were there when we slept, and gone before we woke." This was the Biamians' victory, not in numbers slain or towns captured, but in the change of tone in Viking voices. The proud warriors who had crossed seas to sack kingdoms now whispered warnings near northern fires. They said, "Do not go farther. That land does not answer to steel." The power of these asymmetric tactics was not just in their strategy, but in their meaning. They told the Vikings, "Your rules do not apply here. Your strength is meaningless. When your enemy is never where you strike, your courage cannot stand long in a place where you never see the thing you fear." And in this way, the Biamians defeated not the Viking body, but the Viking mind. In the frozen reaches of the north, where the sky stretched pale and thin over endless forest, fear took a different shape. It did not arrive with banners or horns. It crept in with the snow, with the silence, with the way the wind moved sideways through trees and made no sound. For the Vikings who ventured into Biamian land, The terror they met was not found in blades or beasts, but in the mind. It was a fear older than their gods, stranger than their tales, and quiet enough to be mistaken. For a dream, there were reports of warriors who returned from the north and refused to speak of what they had seen. Others would speak only in fragments. Eyes in the dark, they whispered, drums beneath the ground. One account, scrawled in the margin of an Icelandic codex centuries later, mentioned a man who never again touched iron after a winter. In the kola forests, he feared it would wake them. The note reads, no further explanation was given. The Biamians, as it became clear to Norse explorers, practiced something beyond simple survival. They engaged in a form of spiritual resistance, one that touched the deepest layers of fear. It began with their use of symbols. Unlike Norse runes, which often told of lineage, protection, or battle, Biamian markings were not meant to be read, they were meant to be felt. Carved into bark, smeared across stone, or left as braided tokens dangling in windless air, these symbols invoked unease. They were not warnings in the usual sense, but echoes, like footsteps in snow that vanished behind you. The most unsettling encounters, however, came not from what the Vikings saw, but from what they felt. Many reported the sensation of being watched, not followed, not hunted, but observed with stillness, so complete that even the bravest among them felt their breath shorten. Fires built strong would crackle softer. The warmth of the flame could not chase away the cold that seemed to lean in from the dark. Sometimes, scouts would find one of their own standing motionless at the forest's edge, staring at nothing. When spoken to, the man would turn slowly, as if waking from a dream. There was someone, he might say, but I could not see their feet. What did that mean? No one knew, but such accounts repeated often enough to become lore. And lore, in the Viking world, had weight. Even the bravest Viking raiders began to sense that this was not simply a distant culture defending its land. It was something older, deeper, rooted not only in strategy but in belief. They began to suspect that the fear they felt had been placed there deliberately, like a weight on the soul, carefully shaped over generations. The Biamians seemed to understand something the Vikings did not. That war was not always a matter of strength or steel, but of presence, of entering the mind of your enemy without ever raising a blade. There were whispered tales of the eyes. In the forest, figures that would watch without moving, from dusk until dawn, sometimes for days. One Viking, known only as Jorund the Elder, claimed he saw the same face in 3 different places, separated by miles, and always at twilight. He said the eyes never blinked, and the face never changed. Whether this was a trick of memory, fear, or something else, no one dared to challenge his story. He lived the rest of his life far from the northern roots, refusing to even eat food stored in pinewood chests. Even fire, the sacred tool of warmth and survival in the Arctic, dark seemed to falter under the Biamians' gaze. Flames would sputter, fail to catch, or blow sideways in windless air. On one occasion, a Norse captain tried to light a ceremonial torch to mark a safe passage, but every match broke. His men watched in uneasy silence as the torch remained unlit until they left the grove behind. No enemy had been seen, but something in the air had decided they were not welcome. The Biamians' use of death as message added yet another layer to the quiet dread. They did not leave the fallen in obvious places. Instead, Viking parties would find strange things along the trail: a single helmet balanced on a stump, a circle of arrows pointing inward, or a crude doll made from birch bark, bound in red thread, placed at the edge of a frozen stream. Once, a warrior found a deer carcass laid on its back, its legs folded in a human pose, and its eyes replaced with carved stones. There was no blood, no tracks. The message was unclear, but no one touched it. Then there were the stories of corpses that seemed staged. In one report, a group of scouts stumbled upon a small clearing where 6 Norse bodies had been arranged, in a perfect spiral. Their weapons were stacked in the center. Each face had been carefully turned to the sky, and small finger-sized holes had been pressed into the snow around them, as if something had circled slowly, kneeling. Whether this was done by human hands or something else, no one could say. The scouts abandoned their mission and returned south without further orders. What lingered most was the sound. Not loud sound, but the absence of it. Entire days passed in the Biamians' forests with no birdsong, no breeze, no creaking of trees. Veterans said it was not the same silence one found in empty places. This silence felt shaped, almost pressed, inward, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And in that hush, a warrior's own thoughts became louder, more troubling. They began to imagine things they had never feared before. Being lost, being watched, being forgotten. The Biamians did not need to win battles. They only needed to stay present in the imagination. Their greatest weapon was suggestion, not confrontation. They cultivated uncertainty like a forest grows under snow, slowly, invisibly, but completely. And long after the Norse had left, long after the fires were out and the maps redrawn, the fear remained. Not just in the minds of the men who had marched north, but in the cultural memory of the Viking world. Their stories changed. Sagas began to speak more cautiously of the forests. The bravado that once filled tales of conquest gave way to stories of caution, of reverence for the lands that would not bend. Some even suggested that the Norse concept of Draugr, restless dead, was influenced by Biamian lore, by the rituals and images that blurred the line between spirit and body, between real and imagined. Where once they believed in victory, they now believed in warning in the end. What the Biamians achieved was not domination nor destruction, but survival on their own terms. They left behind no empire, no stone fortresses, no naval fleet. Yet they carved a space in memory, in fear, and in myth. And that is perhaps the deepest power of all. As the cold winds still sweep through the upper forests, as the snow settles in quiet spirals upon untouched ground, something of them remains, not in sight, but in presence, in the rhythm of the trees, in the hush between footfalls, in the way a torch may flicker just a little too soon, in the deep stillness of the northern forests, under skies veiled by winter's gentle snowfall. A profound truth awaited discovery, one that defied Viking expectations and challenged the very core of their beliefs about power and authority. Here, amidst the ancient pines and frozen lakes, leadership was not a birthright defined by strength or lineage, nor a domain reserved solely for men. Instead, among the Biamians, power flowed freely to those most capable, irrespective of gender. This quiet reversal unsettled the Vikings deeply, striking them in ways no weapon ever could. The Vikings came from a world steeped in masculine pride and martial glory. Men wielded swords, commanded ships, and led raids into distant lands. Women, while respected in Norse society, typically occupied roles defined by domestic life and spiritual guidance. The existence of female warriors was largely the stuff of sagas' extraordinary exceptions rather than everyday reality. Shield maidens, though revered, remained a poetic ideal. Distant figures of legend rather than practical leaders in battle or politics. Thus, when the first Norse expeditions encountered the reality of Biamian society, their confusion was profound. Here were women not simply wielding ceremonial authority, but actively leading hunting parties, tactical raids, and spiritual rites. They stood at the center of communal decision-making, their voices carrying quiet confidence, respected without question by both men and women. They bore neither weapons of spectacle nor armor of intimidation. Yet their command was absolute. Among the earliest recorded encounters was the saga, fragment recounting an expedition led by a seasoned Viking named Thor. His party, exploring the edges of the Kola Peninsula, stumbled upon a group of hunters dressed in white furs, their faces obscured by patterned masks. The Vikings approached cautiously, expecting perhaps trade or wary confrontation, but when the lead hunter removed her mask, revealing a serene and steady gaze, Thorvald found himself momentarily speechless. Here was not the opponent he had imagined, not a fierce, bearded enemy, but a woman whose calm presence seemed to quiet even the wind. Her leadership was clear without gesture. Her companions stood attentive but relaxed, awaiting her direction. Thorvald, unsettled, offered gestures of peaceful intention, his tone uncertain. The woman responded not in words but with subtle gestures, an outstretched hand, a nod toward the trail behind them, suggesting politely but firmly that the North move on. Without aggression, without threat, she had asserted complete control. The Vikings withdrew, baffled by the ease with which their presumed dominance had been subverted. This encounter was not isolated. Repeated Viking records speak of female figures who commanded respect not through force but through quiet wisdom, practical competence, and an intimate connection to their land. These women led their people in ways unfamiliar to the Norse mind, merging spiritual authority with practical leadership seamlessly. The Vikings began to refer to them as forest queens, not as figures of romance, but as formidable leaders whose power was unquestioned. Archaeological discoveries centuries later would corroborate these accounts. Excavations near Lake Oni uncovered graves that provided silent testimony to the roles these women occupied. Within burial mounds were female remains, accompanied by symbols of leadership and ritual authority, elaborate ceremonial drums, finely crafted bows, and intricately carved staffs bearing symbols of natural elements and animal spirits. These women were buried not simply as spiritual leaders but as central pillars of Biamian society, respected equally as warriors, shamans, and decision-makers. The Norsemen, whose identity rested heavily on clearly defined gender roles, these women represented a quiet but profound challenge. Viking warriors, accustomed to direct confrontation and straightforward expressions of power, found themselves disoriented. There were no traditional battle lines, no overt displays of strength to oppose. Instead, they faced leadership expressed through calm assertion, intuitive judgment, and communal respect. This confusion often led Norse scribes and poets to describe the women of the Biamians with a mixture of reverence and superstition. Tales emerged describing them as shapeshifters, spirit walkers, or beings who communed effortlessly with nature itself. They were said to move silently through snow-laden forests, hunting alongside wolves and falcons, reading the tracks of prey with uncanny precision. To the Vikings, such abilities blurred the lines between the natural and supernatural worlds, deepening their unease. One notable saga tells of a Norse captain named Bjorn, whose expedition stumbled into a Biamian winter encampment led openly by a female chieftain known as Inari Björn. Arrogant from past victories, initially saw this as an easy conquest. But when his scouts returned, visibly shaken, reporting that Inari stood at the center of a circle formed by both men and women, calmly instructing them in a language Björn did not understand, he hesitated. He approached the camp under peaceful guise, but his attempts to negotiate or intimidate fell flat. Inari listened without expression, her eyes conveying neither anger nor fear. When Bjorn's patience wore thin and he raised his voice in frustration, she responded softly yet with authority that left him silent. She spoke through gestures as much as words, her meaning perfectly clear. This land would not yield to threats, nor would its people succumb to displays of dominance. Björn withdrew, perplexed, his sense of power unsettled by the calm resistance he had encountered. These stories spread back through Norse communities, subtly reshaping Viking perceptions of power and gender. In sagas composed after prolonged Biamian contact, the traditional Norse archetypes of femininity began to evolve. Shield maidens became more nuanced, more realistically drawn, not simply women emulating male warriors, but complex figures whose strength derived from a unique balance of wisdom, spirituality, and practical leadership. The Biamian women, though never fully integrated into Norse mythology, quietly influenced it, altering its contours and expectations. The broader Norse culture, though still largely patriarchal, began to recognize the power of women in more practical, less mythological terms. The example set by the Biamians quietly permeated Viking consciousness, demonstrating that leadership could be silent, effective, and inclusive, not reliant on aggression or force alone. It introduced a quiet question, a subtle challenge to long-held assumptions about gender roles, leadership, and strength within Biamian society itself. The prominence of women was neither revolutionary nor radical, it was simply natural. Leadership was viewed as responsibility, not privilege, grounded in the practical needs of survival and community cohesion. Women led because they were capable, respected, and understood the needs of their people deeply. They were spiritual intermediaries, not because tradition dictated it, but because their intuition and wisdom naturally aligned with the rhythms of the land. This quiet gender reversal, subtle yet powerful, contributed greatly to the Biamian resistance. By confounding Viking expectations, it disrupted their psychological sense of order and hierarchy. It became another layer in the quiet tapestry of resistance the Biamians wove, one based not on direct conflict, but on deep cultural strength and coherence in later centuries. As historians attempted to piece together fragmented accounts of these northern interactions, the presence of women leaders in Biamian society stood out as uniquely remarkable. It represented a quiet revolution, a peaceful yet profound challenge to prevailing norms that had shaped much of medieval Europe. The Biamian women had not set out to overturn gender norms. They had simply lived according to their own wisdom, guided by the practical demands of their environment. Yet, in doing so, they left an enduring legacy, a gentle echo reverberating through history that power need not be loud, strength need not be forceful, and leadership need not be limited by gender. Today, when the northern forests grow quiet beneath winter's soft embrace, the memory of these women remains. Their influence is felt in the subtle ways stories are told, in the respectful pauses given when speaking of the ancient northern peoples. And perhaps, as the snow continues to fall softly, silently covering tracks of ages past. Their quiet strength remains a lasting testament that true leadership transcends expectation, defies constraint, and speaks most powerfully not through force, but through quiet, unwavering presence. In the hushed quiet of a winter dawn, beneath a sky heavy with clouds that promised gentle snow, King Olaf's ships slipped through icy waters toward an island nestled at the heart of a frozen lake. This place, whispered about by traders and feared by warriors, was the mysterious heartland of the Biamians. Olaf believed this decisive strike would finally bend the elusive northern tribe to his will. The island emerged slowly through morning mists, its rooftops gleaming strangely, catching faint, early light. They seemed crafted from mirrors or polished ice, shimmering softly, enchanting and disorienting at once. Vikings whispered anxiously as their vessels glided closer, uncertain of what lay ahead but determined to confront the mystery that had so thoroughly unsettled them. As the Norsemen disembarked, cautiously approaching the settlement, silence wrapped around them like a tangible veil. Not a soul stirred. No guards appeared to challenge them. The mirrored roofs reflected their cautious movements, distorting faces and bodies into surreal, elongated shapes, deepening their unease. Suddenly, with the slightest rustle of snow-laden branches, the silence fractured. From hidden recesses, around the village's edge, soft, whispering sounds drifted, gentle, rhythmic, indistinct, like the murmuring of distant voices. Olaf's men paused, tense and alert, their weapons ready, yet finding nothing tangible to strike against. Then came the smoke. A pale, sulphurous haze rolled silently from unseen sources, enveloping them without violence, but with profound, quiet efficiency. Warriors coughed, eyes stinging, vision blurred. Confusion spread swiftly. Commands from leaders became uncertain. Murmurs lost in the thickening fog. The Biamians struck gently, almost softly, arrows whispering rather than hissing, each precisely aimed to disarm rather than destroy. The Norse fighters, accustomed to battle cries and clear foes, found no targets, only shifting silhouettes in swirling mists, quiet footsteps, shadows that dissolved the instant they were seen. King Olaf, isolated in the fog, felt the quiet more keenly than any wound. He realized too late the true nature of the battle, a silent demonstration of power more profound than violence. A lesson in humility delivered without harshness or cruelty. Hours later, as Olaf's surviving warriors retreated toward their ships, the mirrored roofs caught the dying light of day, glowing softly, peacefully. They carried no scars of battle, no marks of conquest. The island remained as it had always been, untouched, tranquil, victorious in its gentle, silent way. Despite the quiet, unsettling fear inspired by the Biamians, Viking merchants could not entirely abandon the riches that flowed from the northern forests. Biamian territories were abundant in furs, ivory, amber, and rare herbs, goods highly sought by wealthy patrons from distant lands. As the years passed, the Vikings found themselves drawn back, not as conquerors, but as cautious traders. At the edge of the Biamian world, seasonal trading posts emerged, places of wary but respectful exchange. Here, amidst snow-covered fields and softly whispering pines, Vikings and Biamians interacted peacefully, driven together by mutual economic necessity. The marketplaces operated under unspoken rules, each side careful to avoid offense, mindful of past hostilities, and respectful of the silent power that had once turned warriors into retreat. Goods were exchanged in quiet ceremony, with careful examination and deliberate gestures replacing spoken negotiation. Biamian traders brought pelts of extraordinary quality fox fur, softer than silk, reindeer hides that shimmered gently in sunlight, and carved amber pieces glowing warmly as though they held small fragments of sun. The Vikings, in turn, offered fine silver crafted into subtle jewelry, woven textiles rich with intricate patterns, and steel tools whose practical value the Biamians respected deeply. Each exchange was precise, balanced, conducted with a careful dignity born from shared understanding of the fragility of peace. Yet, even these peaceful interactions bore a quiet tension. Vikings, ever mindful of their unsettling encounters, kept a wary eye on the forest's edge, half expecting shapes to appear from the mist. Biamians, courteous but distant, watched silently, protective of their secrets and careful never to reveal too much of their true selves. This trade, fragile yet enduring, highlighted the complexities of their relationship. Both cultures needed what the other could provide, yet recognized the limits of trust. The Biamians held economic power through their exceptional goods, maintaining a quiet autonomy the Vikings could neither dominate nor ignore. Vikings gained economic benefit, but paid a subtle price: the ongoing acceptance of a land and people who refused to yield. Thus, the marketplace became a symbol of uneasy interdependence, a delicate balance sustained not through friendship, but through quiet respect and mutual necessity. A calm acknowledgement that survival sometimes depended not on strength alone, but on understanding, tolerance, and quiet compromise. As decades passed, the relationship between Vikings and Biamians began to evolve beyond mere trade and wary interaction. Slowly, subtly, the boundaries between their cultures softened, allowing cautious yet meaningful exchanges of knowledge, tradition, and spiritual practices. Although they never fully integrated, their interactions grew deeper and more nuanced, marked by moments of genuine mutual respect and understanding. Seasonal trading markets, once merely economic exchanges, gradually transformed into cultural crossroads where ideas quietly intertwined. Norse merchants began to adopt small Biamian customs, such as silent gestures of respect during negotiations or the careful, reverent handling of traded goods. Conversely, Biamian traders quietly observed and absorbed elements of Norse craftsmanship and decorative styles, incorporating them into their own symbolic artwork and everyday objects. One significant area of subtle exchange was spiritual beliefs. Vikings, initially unsettled by Biamian shamanic practices, grew increasingly curious about their quiet rituals and reverence for nature. Over time, Norse traders began participating discreetly in certain ceremonial observances. They would sit quietly at the edges of ceremonial circles, respectfully observing drumming rites and trance rituals. These experiences did not replace Norse spiritual traditions, but enriched them, introducing new layers of meaning and appreciation for the subtle interplay between humans and their environment. The Biamians, too, found points of resonance within Norse mythology and storytelling. They listened attentively to sagas recounted around shared fires during trading seasons, fascinated by tales of Odin's quest for wisdom and Freya's protective embrace of warriors. Biamian shamans began incorporating elements of these stories into their own oral traditions, subtly weaving new narratives that bridged their worlds. Language, though initially a barrier, gradually became a bridge. Both peoples slowly learned fragments of each other's languages, developing a shared vocabulary for trade, negotiation, and respectful interaction. Common terms emerged, combining elements from both tongues, reflecting their growing interconnectedness. This linguistic blending was not comprehensive but symbolic, a quiet acknowledgement of their mutual influence and respect. Shared challenges further deepened their subtle alliance. As external pressures increased from expanding kingdoms and emerging trading powers, Vikings and Biamians found common cause in defending their autonomy. Quiet alliances formed against threats from southern and eastern territories, with coordinated strategies developed through mutual respect and cautious cooperation. Battles were rare, but strategic cooperation in defense of trading posts and sacred sites became increasingly common. This gradual cultural exchange also quietly reshaped perceptions of gender and leadership among the Norsemen. Influenced by the Biamian model of inclusive leadership, Norse communities began subtly shifting their traditional hierarchies. Women in Norse settlements found themselves with greater responsibilities, participating more actively in trade negotiations, resource management, and community leadership. Though incremental, these changes marked a quiet, profound evolution influenced directly by their northern neighbors. Artistic exchange flourished as well. Vikings admired the intricate symbolism woven into Biamian clothing and ceremonial objects, adopting similar motifs in their jewelry and textiles. The Biamians, appreciating Norse metalwork and decorative carving, integrated these elements into their artifacts, creating hybrid styles that carried elements of both cultures. These creations, passed down through generations, became tangible, symbols of their complex, subtle relationship in time. The harsh boundary that once separated Viking and Biamian worlds softened into a gentle frontier of quiet coexistence. Each culture retained its distinct identity but allowed itself to be gently shaped by the other. This was neither assimilation nor conquest, but a respectful blending born of mutual benefit, understanding, and quiet appreciation for their shared humanity. Generations later, stories of their early conflicts faded into quiet legend, overshadowed by narratives of cooperation, shared knowledge, and mutual respect. The once feared forests of the Biamians became places of gentle reverence, honored for their lessons in quiet strength, wisdom, and balance. The Vikings, too, were remembered not merely as conquerors, but as learners and subtle collaborators who recognized the value of quiet strength and cultural exchange. This quiet, gradual blending of traditions and knowledge left an enduring legacy. The forests, rivers, and lakes of the north remained untouched by domination, their quiet beauty preserved through mutual respect and careful coexistence. Each society, enriched by the other, carried forward a deeper understanding of the world where strength was not always loud, wisdom not always spoken, and power often found in quiet reflection and gentle interaction. Thus, the Vikings and Biamians, once cautious adversaries, became quiet allies. Their story, not one of conquest, but of quiet transformation, mutual respect, and subtle, enduring friendship. The northern lands, shaped by this gentle cultural exchange, stood as lasting testament to the quiet power of mutual understanding and respect. A legacy of peace, born not of battle, but of careful listening, quiet compromise, and shared humanity. As centuries drifted gently onward, the delicate equilibrium established between the Vikings and Biamians began to slowly unravel, not through conflict or aggression, but through the subtle pressures of changing times and external forces. Both societies, once fiercely independent yet quietly interconnected, found themselves confronting new challenges from the rapidly evolving medieval world. The steady advance of Christianity across Scandinavia and Northern Europe gradually reshaped Viking culture. Pagan traditions faded softly into the background, replaced by the structured practices and beliefs brought by missionaries and monarchs eager to unite their realms under a single, orderly faith. The once proud Norse warriors who had freely explored distant lands now found themselves bound by new religious expectations and shifting political allegiances. In the northern territories, Viking settlements, once vibrant hubs of independent trade and cultural exchange, transformed into quiet outposts controlled increasingly by centralized authorities. Kings and clergy from distant capitals imposed their laws and structures, diminishing local autonomy and quietly eroding traditional Norse ways of life. The vibrant sagas of exploration and conquest slowly gave way to tales of kingship, religion, and obedience. For the Biamians, the pressures were subtler yet equally profound. Their semi-nomadic lifestyle and deep spiritual connection to their land became increasingly incompatible with the administrative demands and territorial claims of surrounding powers. The rise of the Hanseatic League, expanding Rus principalities, and growing Christian influence created new realities that quietly but relentlessly encroached upon their traditional territories and ways of life. Their hunting grounds and sacred sites, once remote and untouched, became contested spaces. Settlements expanded slowly but surely into territories once respected for their quiet, untouched beauty. Traders, driven by economic ambitions, brought new demands, disturbing the careful balance the Biamians had long maintained with their environment. Gradually, the quiet autonomy and cultural cohesion that had defined them began to fray. The younger generations of Biamians, drawn by opportunities and pressures from neighboring societies, started to migrate slowly outward, integrating into expanding communities of the Rus, Karelians, and Sami. These migrations were quiet but persistent, gently eroding the core population that had maintained traditional Biamian practices and beliefs. Villages and ceremonial grounds, once filled with quiet reverence and active tradition, fell gradually into disuse and silence. As traditional hunting and gathering areas became less accessible, Biamian communities increasingly settled into more permanent villages, adjusting their lifestyles to survive within the new economic realities imposed upon them. This shift, while subtle, represented a profound change, slowly diluting their distinct identity as they adapted to the customs and demands of surrounding cultures. Christianization and cultural integration further accelerated the subtle erosion of distinct Biamian traditions. Spiritual ceremonies, once vibrant and central to community life, became quiet. Private affairs held discreetly in remote places or integrated cautiously into emerging Christian practices. Sacred drums, symbolic masks, and ritual objects were quietly hidden away, preserved as cherished relics rather than actively used. Over generations, the distinct identities of both Vikings and Biamians faded gently into the broader cultural tapestry of Northern Europe. The Norsemen, once known for their fierce independence and bold exploration, gradually became subjects of powerful kingdoms and integrated Christian communities. The Biamians, quietly resilient in their traditions, blended into the surrounding populations, leaving behind only subtle traces of their former distinctiveness. Yet, despite this gentle decline, neither culture disappeared entirely. Both left enduring legacies subtly embedded in regional traditions, folklore, and customs. The Vikings contributed enduring tales, craftsmanship, and maritime skills, their spirit of exploration quietly shaping Europe's historical trajectory. The Biamians, through their quiet strength and reverence for nature, influenced local spiritual practices, artistic expressions, and environmental awareness in ways that persisted through generations. Today, echoes of these cultures remain softly audible in northern landscapes, traditions, and collective memories. They exist quietly in the rhythms of local festivals, in the designs of woven textiles and carved wooden artifacts, and in stories passed gently from elders to children. Both the Vikings and Biamians, through their subtle decline, became integral threads within the rich tapestry of Northern Europe's historical and cultural heritage, their quiet legacy a testament to resilience, adaptation, and the enduring power of quiet coexistence. In the gentle whispering of northern forests and the soft silence of winter snows lies the enduring legacy of the Biamians, a people who quietly reshaped notions of strength, power, and coexistence. Their history, marked not by grand conquests or sprawling empires, teaches lessons subtle yet profound, offering timeless wisdom for understanding human interaction, resilience, and cultural survival. The Biamians never conquered distant lands or forged expansive kingdoms, yet their influence is unmistakably present. Through quiet resistance and strategic patience, they demonstrated that true strength is often silent, measured not in loud victories but in the ability to maintain identity, autonomy, and dignity even in the face of overwhelming external pressures. Their approach to conflict, grounded in psychological insight and environmental mastery, offered a profound counterpoint to traditional warfare. Rather than meeting aggression with aggression, they employed strategies designed to disorient and discourage, turning opponents' strength into vulnerability. This subtle, intelligent form of resistance has inspired generations to reconsider the nature of power and conflict resolution, highlighting the effectiveness of restraint and strategic patience over brute force. Biamians also provided a powerful example of gender inclusivity and equitable leadership. Their society, marked by female warriors, shamans, and leaders, quietly challenged prevailing notions of gender roles, demonstrating that effective leadership and spiritual authority transcend gender distinctions. This legacy gently influenced neighboring cultures, subtly reshaping perceptions of leadership, strength, and social organization, and offering a quiet but significant model for future generations. Their economic interactions taught valuable lessons about interdependence and the quiet power of mutual respect. By carefully managing their trading relationships and maintaining autonomy in economic affairs, the Biamians demonstrated that economic strength need not come at the expense of cultural integrity or independence. Their marketplaces became examples of quiet diplomacy, where mutual benefit and respect took precedence over dominance and exploitation. The Biamians' reverence for nature and deep understanding of their environment have left an enduring mark. They taught that true prosperity is not measured by wealth alone, but by sustainable living, harmony with the natural world, and respect for the delicate balance that sustains life. Their traditions emphasized careful resource management and profound ecological awareness, lessons increasingly relevant in modern times. In folklore and cultural narratives, the Biamians endure quietly as symbols of wisdom, resilience, and balanced coexistence. Their tales, passed gently through generations, remind listeners that cultural survival and autonomy do not require loud declarations or violent resistance, but rather quiet confidence. measured responses, and unwavering commitment to core values and traditions. Ultimately, the Biamians' most significant legacy lies in their quiet example of how to live thoughtfully and resiliently amidst challenges and changes. They teach that true strength is often quiet, true leadership inclusive, and true prosperity sustainable, in a world frequently defined by noise and haste. The gentle legacy of the Biamians offers a quiet, enduring reminder of the power and wisdom found in silence, balance, and thoughtful coexistence. As twilight softly settles over the northern forests, the gentle echoes of the Biamians linger, woven quietly into the very fabric of the land itself. Their story, one of subtle resilience, quiet strength, and enduring wisdom, remains a gentle reminder that even the mightiest empires can be tempered by the quiet, measured resistance of those who deeply understand and respect their environment. The forests, lakes, and quiet trails of the north still whisper their stories to those who listen carefully. Trees rustle gently, recalling ancient ceremonies performed beneath their branches. Frozen lakes reflect softly, mirroring skies that once watched quietly over trading gatherings and peaceful negotiations. Every gentle snowfall carries with it the quiet memory of a people who stood with quiet dignity, neither conquered nor conquering, but living harmoniously with the land and each other in modern times. As societies increasingly seek lessons in sustainability, inclusivity, and peaceful coexistence, the quiet legacy of the Biamians offers valuable guidance. Their respectful approach to nature, their equitable social structures, and their intelligent strategies for resolving conflicts quietly yet firmly, provide timeless wisdom for navigating contemporary challenges. Their story reminds us that strength does not always manifest through dominance, nor leadership through loud commands. Sometimes, the most enduring victories come quietly, through subtle acts of resilience, understanding, and gentle perseverance. The Biamians teach us that true power lies not in force, but in balance, not in conquering, but in coexisting harmoniously. As night gently descends upon the northern world, stars flicker softly in the vast, silent skies, quietly watching over the lands where the Biamians once lived. Their quiet presence, though physically faded, endures spiritually, resonating gently within the hearts and minds of those who remember, those who learn, and those who continue to seek wisdom in the quiet, balanced harmony of nature. In this gentle remembrance, the Biamian story never truly ends. Instead, it continues softly, whispered by forests, echoed by gentle winds, and carried forward quietly through generations. It remains an enduring testament to the quiet, resilient strength of a people who quietly and profoundly shaped the course of history, not with loud victories, but with gentle, unwavering presence and quiet dignity.